I am very excited to be here and to see that we've got several participants joining us in the audience. My name is Emmy Horses, and I am the Program Manager of Special Initiatives at First Peoples Fund. Today is the second virtual workshop in a series of 4 that highlight the work of First Peoples Fund, We the Peoples Before Education Fellows. We the Peoples Before is a celebration of First Peoples Fund's 25th anniversary and of Native sovereignty and cultural expression. This event, We the Peoples Before, will be held on July 1st through the 2nd at the John F. Kennedy Center for Performing Arts in Washington, D.C. We invite you to join us for this event in person and online. To learn more, please visit wethepeoplesbefore.org. I'm gonna put that in the chat for everyone. To receive monthly updates on the event and on our organization, we ask that you subscribe to our newsletter, which I'm also going to put in the chat. So go ahead and check out that link if you'd like to subscribe to our newsletter. Now I'm going to go a little bit further into what we are doing with We the Peoples Before, the educational initiative. Indigenous peoples across the United States are largely invisible within the American educational system. In the classrooms where Indigenous history is taught, state standards that address Indigenous histories often do not extend beyond the 1800s, and these standards are often not required content in classrooms. Misinformation also proves to be significant and serves as a multi-generational issue that affects not only learners in classrooms, but the educators themselves, with many teachers having been provided with incorrect representations of Indigenous histories and cultures. The We the Peoples Before educational initiative seeks to change this by creating multimedia digital educational resources that are being developed by an Indigenous team of educators and can be used across multiple subject areas. As part of a growing digital library, the initial round of the We the Peoples Before curriculum is being developed in partnership with the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts and is to be released in the fall of 2022. This curriculum challenges educators to approach learning about Indigenous nations and communities in the context of federal and state policies, which have dispossessed us of our lands, stories, languages, artistic practices, and ways of knowing. The work of the artists and culture bearers in First Peoples Fund's family centers this work on how culture bearers and artists across our many nations carry on adapting and reclaiming ancestral practices to create resilient communities. Today, you will hear from 2 of our Indigenous educators who are a part of the We the Peoples Before Education Fellowship, who are leading this effort within this inaugural group. You will have a chance to hear from their experience as educators and as students and as classroom leaders and school leaders for what is needed in today's classroom and what you can do to help. Please join me in welcoming our panelists, Sandy Packo and Nicole Butler-Hooton. So I'm going to let you each take a moment to introduce yourselves and the work that you've done, your teaching expertise, and whatever else you would like to share. I'm going to pass it to Sandy first.
Kanuhitben Ubanga Sandy. Greetings, welcome everybody. My name is Sandy Packo. My pronouns are she and her. I am Inupiaq, born and raised in Alaska. I come from Anchorage, Alaska. My mom's ancestral land is in the Shaktoolik region of Alaska. So I am enrolled in Shaktoolik Village tribe. I have been an educator for about 10 years now. K-12 music was my specialty. And then after teaching music for 10 years, I just actually recently moved over to the American Indian College Fund, where I'm the college readiness program administrator over there. So doing education work for our Native communities in a larger way that has, I think, more outreach. So very similar work to the work that I do with the First Peoples Fund here.
Thank you, Sandy. Nicole?
Good afternoon, Jayla, Shaushi, Nicole, Butler-Hooton. My voice is a little bit strained, so I apologize for that. It's allergy season in Oregon right now. So, Ho'owanti, I hope you are well. I am a member of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz of Oregon, the Chetco Band, and the San Carlos Apache Tribe of Arizona. I've been a second and fourth grade teacher in Eugene, Oregon for about 15 years. And this year I've stepped out of that role to do some instructional coaching. I'm really passionate about Oregon's Senate Bill 13 Tribal Shared History Curriculum and how we can get that into the hands of educators and how we can support them on their journey to really thinking about indigenizing spaces, educational spaces. I identify and go by pronouns she, her. I'm also the 2021 Oregon Teacher of the Year, the first Indigenous person to win this award. I'm looking forward to our time together today.
Thank you, Nicole. And I'm going to take a moment now before we dive into this conversation to explain a little bit more about the We the Peoples Before framework. And I have a graphic here to share with you all that talks about the two different pathways that we're going to be addressing today. One of which is the learning pathway, which follows know, honor, and share, which is a vital piece of the work that we do within First Peoples Fund. So it is our intent to help and support educators and students in classrooms to know the histories of Indigenous artists, culture bearers, nations, and lands, not just those that they reside on, but those of nations who have passed through their lands or who were relocated or removed from those lands forcibly by the United States. There are many different pieces of history that classroom educators and students have a right to know that they haven't had access to in the past. And so it is our intent to help them to know these histories through the voices of Indigenous educators, Indigenous curriculum developers, Indigenous artists, and Indigenous culture bearers. So providing them those tools to be able to learn that content. The next piece of that learning pathway is to honor the cultural and artistic knowledge of Indigenous artists, culture bearers, nations, and lands. And this is important because we often see the ways in which Indigenous peoples and knowledge exist within curriculum. What is available to many educators today is very problematic and harmful, and creates a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding amongst learners and teachers in classrooms. So through this framework, we'll be able to provide ways in which teachers and learners can help to honor that in authentic and truthful ways by learning directly from Indigenous communities. And the final piece of the learning pathway is to share that acquired knowledge about Indigenous artists, culture bearers, nations, and lands through meaningful and appropriate methods. And one of the big questions here that amongst the We the Peoples Before Education Fellows is that we often see this sharing piece that exists in the world can often fall into cultural appropriation and can often be harmful to Indigenous communities. So another piece of this framework and the tools that we'll be providing through the We the Peoples Before curriculum will be to assist educators and students in learning how to share this knowledge and what they learn from these artists and culture bearers in a way that is not only authentic, but also respectful and is being taught from the perspective of Native people. Beyond that, we also have another piece of this framework, which is the content pathway, which goes from dispossession to adaptation to reclamation, to resilience. And we want to talk about all four of those pieces, because often when we talk about Indigenous histories and knowledge, we hear about pre-contact or pre-reservation days experiences of Native peoples. And then we hear about forced removals. We hear about all of these negative things that Native people have experienced within the United States, but we don't hear about the ways in which Native communities have held onto and thrived beyond those negative experiences. And so we start with dispossession because it's important to learn about what has caused some of those harms, what has caused some of these negative experiences amongst Native communities. So the dispossession portion will examine the ways in which Indigenous communities were dispossessed of lands, language, ways of knowing, and artistic practices through federal, state, and colonial policy. I'm going to let Sandy and Nicole touch on that a little bit more later on. But then moving beyond that dispossession, we want to think more about those positive ways in which Native peoples have lived and experienced their existence within the colonial state of the United States of America. By thinking about adaptation, how did Native communities adapt to be able to hold on to those practices? Whenever they were moved to a different part of the country, how did they adapt those practices? What do Native people do today that is different than what we've done in the past in order to hold on to that knowledge, to be able to pass it on to the next generation? Then reclamation, how do Indigenous artists and culture bearers reclaim those traditional practices and share that knowledge amongst their nations and communities and beyond? So how did they reclaim that to be able to help them to thrive, which brings us to the resilience component. So we want educators and students to learn about the resilient communities that exist today, not just that historical pathway to our experiences, but how do we exist today where we are visible and vibrant and have positive experiences and beautiful things that are happening in our communities through the lens of culture bearers and artists? How did they help to guide us down this path to hold on to our cultural practices, our religious and spiritual practices, our artistic practices, our languages? What was the role of artists and culture bearers throughout that process? And how can we help educators and students to understand that we, the peoples before, are still here, we still exist, and we still have vibrant, beautiful communities? And so I just wanted to take a moment there to talk about the framework, and I'm going to stop there and kind of guide this conversation with Sandy and Nicole to continue thinking about the ways in which this framework can support students and educators in classrooms, in communities, in educational spaces outside of schools. And so I want to kind of start by asking Sandy and Nicole, whoever wants to take the question, why is it important for educators to bring those present experiences of Indigenous peoples forward into the classroom today?
I don't mind starting. So I love the question. Thank you for the framework and for all of you joining us today, because as you know, you must be committed to this work and have entry into the schools and systems that we need to shift so that Native people are thriving today. So I'll start with thinking about presence, right? We know that presence is power. And for far too long, students and educators and educational leaders have entered this work with a focus on Indigenous communities in the past tense. If we all just kind of think and reflect on our own experiences, this mindset has been harmful to all students and communities. The movement and the commitment forward, I believe, shows racial justice, racial equity. And that's the action that we want to see and inspire. So when we talk and learn about Indigenous people with this curriculum, we'll be supporting educational leaders can make their classrooms, their spaces, places of collective healing. And so I think if we're really thinking about Native people and their resilience and their journey forward, that's what strengthening the Indigenous presence is about. It's really about building relationship that creates foundational learning elements of understanding that Native people are here, they're in our communities, they're in our classrooms. I always tell my elementary students, you see them at the grocery stores, you see them when you play sports. And so we have to challenge this idea of this erasure of Native people and highlight really how to live in right relationship with our Native communities. Where I live in, we are a couple hours away from reservation life, but we still need to acknowledge, right, that that's existing within our space, within our state. And so I'll just end by saying that living the intention of bringing presence is what we're going to hopefully create with this curriculum. And a move to action is what we want to happen so that we can teach about Native perspective in the present and really affirm our Indigenous students and their identity, which many of us Native people have not had the opportunity. So it's really time to think about how we exist today.
Thank you, Nicole. I really loved what you said about collective healing and how that is such an important part of this, is that within classrooms, that there's a big piece of that as we address that invisibility and the perceived erasure, I think is what I was hearing, is that people think that Native people don't exist. I'm sure that all of us here have probably heard comments about how, oh, I thought there weren't any more Native people, and people being shocked that those are our identities. But to kind of correct that within classrooms and shift that thinking. So that really resonated with me. Thank you, Nicole. Sandy, do you have anything to add?
Yes, I think everything Nicole said just really resonates with my thoughts on this question too. When I began working for both the Alaska Native Heritage Center years ago when I was living in Alaska, and then since then the American Indian College Fund, the thing that struck me, that really struck me working in those ed spaces, is that misinformation and lack of information about our communities is really a widespread issue, and it's very rampant. And kind of like what you're saying, Emmy, I've had people ask me, what do you mean you're Native? I thought Natives don't exist anymore. And I would get questions like that. And I would get questions about my culture in ways that kind of characterized my culture. Like, oh, do you live in igloos still? Do you go ace fishing and whatnot? And then it was just really apparent to me the lack of information and the misinformation that I encountered in both positions. And even in the classroom, there have been times where I've picked up a book and they are talking about my cultures. I look at a history textbook and there will be lines in the textbook that really don't resonate with the reality of my culture and my community. And to me, it's just really sad and surprising, not surprising, that information is still being taught in classrooms. And so I think it's really important that we continue to increase awareness of Native communities for staff and students in general, especially non-Native staff and students, so that we can correct that misinformation or that lack of information. I think that kind of going back to what you've said, Emmy, Native communities are often talked as if they exist solely in the past. It creates a climate of not giving us space today in our lives, in our work circles, in our academic circles, in society. We're not receiving the space that we need to exist in as fully fledged human beings. And I think another component of that is our Native identities are sometimes very harshly judged against some of this past or inaccurate caricatures of Natives that are taken for truth. And that creates spaces for discrimination. It creates spaces for lack of inclusion and lack of understanding for our communities. But in addition to those things, I think it's also important to do this work, and I believe this curriculum is important for Native students and staff as well, because they struggle with visibility in the classroom. That's been a widespread reported issue. You can look at White House studies on this very topic from just a few years ago. We were finding out that most communities were voicing just a lack of visibility, a lack of representation in the curriculum, and understandings of the students and the staff, and how they think in Indigenous, with Indigenous mindsets. We're often referred to as the 1% in education spaces. And this to me is heartbreaking, because if we're just the 1%, I think what often happens is, well, we can provide maybe just a little bit of services for them, but we don't need to provide everything that we can. They're just a small subset. And that's just, it just breaks my heart, because I think all of our students deserve the best from all of us. Because of that reason, academic spaces haven't felt welcome to a lot of Native communities. Western non-Native ideologies are treated often as the sole truth and the norm. And if you don't fall in with that cultural spectrum, your lived experiences are devalued. And when a person's lived experiences are devalued, that can very easily lead to systemic discrimination, which affects all parts of a person's life, where they work, what they choose to do, their education, their just entire existence is impacted by that. For Native communities especially, this compounds these negative outcomes compound, and they affect self-determination and tribal sovereignty, which are really valued and I think really important to tribal communities. And when tribal sovereignty is impacted, I think that begins to ensure a continued perpetuation of white supremacist structures in society that value one culture above another, and it creates spaces where communities they begin to struggle with discrimination and discriminatory practices. And for education, we really believe in helping every child succeed. So I think this curriculum gives us a shot at helping to level the playing field a little bit for educators and for students, non-Native and Native. What benefits one group really benefits us all.
There was so much there, Sandy. I think early in what you were sharing, you had said that the lack of knowledge that I think the educators have going into classrooms. And for me as an educator, as a former special education teacher, something that I often experienced with my colleagues was that they just didn't know. It felt like they may not have had a lot of opportunity to learn from and about Native people in accurate ways, to learn the truth of our history here in the United States. And for me, that was a real challenge, because I understood that what was then being shared with their students and how that lack of knowledge was then passed on to this next generation of learners. And I think like beyond that, for me as an educator growing up around my culture, I grew up on the reservation, growing up in community with people who practiced the same culture gave me a very kind of grounded understanding of my own kind of ancestral knowledge. And so as a teacher who has taught in urban settings where we had almost no Native students in our school, but then when you did encounter a Native student, what is their experience like? And how does that invisibility impact them and the misinformation impact them? How does that harm those students and their families? And then that next generation after that, and kind of what is our role as educators in that? And I think I hear that from both of you. And I'm thinking back to our past event and also the conversations that we've had within the educational initiative, is what kind of, I don't know, it's such a big question. And there's so much to say and so much work to do within that, where we're trying to correct. And as Nicole shared, be in right relationship with one another and with the land and with the community. So how do we build that? How do we create that? And I'm hoping that through this framework, we're able to do some of that work to start building that with educators and in classrooms across the nation. And so I kind of want to, Nicole, unless you have something you'd like to add about what Sandy said, I want to jump into the next question that I have is, why is it important for educators and students to engage in this framework or others like it? And how can that support learning for students and educators too, right? Because we've all shared that they need to learn, and we need to create more opportunity for educators to learn.
I don't mind jumping first on this one. I think for all of the reasons we've just discussed, it's important for educators and students to engage in this framework. We've been talking about our Native students and staff needing and deserving to feel a sense of safety and comfort. I actually wrote a little bit about this for the fellowship in a material that will probably be released later. Emmy, you had us do, we did essays kind of talking about the importance of this work, and the gist of what I was saying in answer to this question kind of touched on my personal experiences of being a Native student, both in the K-12 space, but even also in the college space, getting ready to start a career. And in both spaces, there was sometimes a certain communication style that was prized above the communication styles that I had grown up with, being an Indigenous person. And a lot of things were expected of me, like direct eye contact, being able to talk at a faster pace, like firm handshake, having a really loud present voice. And those are complete opposite of ways that I grew up. And I don't think I realized that until I actually began working for my very first Native nonprofit. But I had always felt somewhat overlooked by my teachers and by the staff, because they thought I was just shy, kind of maybe a little bit, maybe I looked or appeared like I was a little bit less engaged with the material, but I don't think that was me at all. I had a completely different understanding of my sense of self. I thought of myself as a good listener. I thought about myself as a deep processor of information, and I wanted to give time and weight and quality to what I was going to say before I would say it. And in the schools, it wasn't seen as that at all. So for the first time in my life that I actually felt comfortable and safe in my own skin, to just be myself. It was the first time that I was working for a Native nonprofit. So I was well into my 20s by this point. I was already actually working on my master's degree. And when I think back on that experience and that first day, that I was like, oh, whoa, I can just be myself here. Like, everybody understands me. There's just a sense of indescribable joy that I had, and comfort. And I was able to really take off as a leader in that position, because I was accepted, and I was accepted in a way that made sense to me. And I want that for our students. I want for our students to be able to feel that and not have to wait until they're into their 20s to get that experience, or maybe never have that experience at all. So I think it's really important for educators and our students to learn about our Native communities for all of those reasons. And also, I have like a kind of a list of academic reasons that have been kind of going through my head over the last couple of months as I've been working on this. For me, I think that staff and students need more accurate representative materials that are of high quality. The few times that I have tried to do this work on my own in the classroom, when I try to go find materials to help me, not just about my cultures, but about other cultures, it's very questionable at best what's out there. Sometimes it's not even written by Native people, and then it's a struggle. And then the times when I do integrate culture into my classroom, other teachers have seen what I've been doing and teaching in my classroom, and they say, "Can you come to my classroom? Wow, what are you doing over there? Something is making a difference." The students are coming out and they're talking about what they learned, and I'm starting to hear these wonderful things. I don't know how to do that. I don't know where to find the materials for that. Can you help me? So this curriculum provides an entryway for our staff to be able to share higher quality materials with our students. I think with the curriculum, my desires over life have been for us to have a multidimensional approach with wide representation across Native communities. That maybe exists, but not in the most accessible formats for educators. They have to really go out and search for it in some instances, and they might not know what's out there, and they might not even have the time to go looking for that. I think it's also important to have a curriculum that's well thought out, with terms and concepts carefully defined and taught to raise awareness. One of the things that we've been discussing in our curriculum is Native identifiers. Do you identify as Native American? Do you identify as American Indian? You know, how do you identify? And we're able to take some time and break down, like, okay, these are different ways of looking at some of these terms and concepts, and we're able to provide that to our educators. And that's really powerful because we haven't had that offered before. I think it's also nice to have a curriculum with a tangible direction of progression from the dispossession to adaptation and reclamation to resilience. It's tangible, it's easy for our educators and our students to follow and know where the direction of the curriculum is going. And that's always best practices for students anyway. And then having curriculum that has context is another big thing. When I think about context, I think Native communities, we identify with our land, with our histories, with our past and our presents. We like to be taken in a whole context approach and a whole person approach. And this curriculum will provide that in a way that we don't have online right now. And then last, I think it's important for curriculum to be provided for educators that incorporates Indigenous methodologies. I know I've been writing with storytelling styles in some of my lessons because that's important to my culture. And it's nice for students to actually see the content delivered with Indigenous methods. It's something that's coming from the community, not outside. Those are all just reasons that I really think this framework is going to be very powerful for educators across the country.
Thank you, Sandy. Nicole, I'm going to let you add something before I say anything.
Thanks, Sandy. I wrote down some notes and you touched on everything that I was going to share, but I think with this curriculum, I know with this curriculum, the lessons that we're going to create and the partnership with the culture bearers that we're learning about and we'll be engaging in with DC will really give educators training and lessons to sustain and honor Indigenous cultural practice. And then the hope and the outcome would be that we're really asking educators and those educational leaders to really reflect and ask themselves what they're doing to uphold and teach accurate, truthful history. Because again, just to go back to that idea of collective healing, how we share power in our classrooms and within our educational frameworks, this curriculum, by centering on just what Sandy said, from dispossession to adaptation to reclamation to resilience, I mean, that's going to give our students the idea, I picture a medicine wheel, right? The idea of all their needs, all students will hopefully be met. And we really want to challenge educators and students to learn about traditional ways of knowing and including art and history and stories. And you know, I think about 15 years of teaching and I think about how many mentor texts I use with elementary age and primary age students and how many really, really there have been that are culturally relevant. And thanks to some new authors that are out within the last 5 to 10 years who are really bringing that presence to our classroom. Shout out to Tracy Sorrell on here. But really all Native, we can call them culture bearers, who are bringing their skills into these spaces to create accurate and truthful history so that our Native students can be seen. And it's a shared way of spreading knowledge. And so I think, and it sounds like a little bit of a freedom dream, but really we're creating a new educational legacy for our Native students. And we need more culturally relevant curriculum. The idea is, how do we enter into this work in meaningful ways? And so we hope that the framework will provide that, because we also need to, you know, with all educators, but non-Native educators in particular, we need to give them the permission to be co-learners so that they do have some entry into this work. Because I see some questions in the chat that we'll answer later, but you know, we ask ourselves, well, where do we start, and how will it support sustained learning from K-12, right? Because we want this to start, well, even before. But yeah, so I think the lessons created in the partnership are going to be exciting to support within the framework and the model and the advocacy of our Native communities.
Thank you, Nicole. So I heard both of you say something about educators wanting to do better, that there are so many teachers out there who want to do the right thing, and they're asking for these types of tools. They're asking how they can teach about accurate Native histories and accurate Native experiences today, accurately represent and positively represent Native communities today, and not just touching on those harmful experiences that Native people all across the United States have experienced. And I think that happens often in our group as well with the education fellows, to say like that we're learning from one another, and that there are things that maybe we don't know about different tribal histories in different parts of the country. I know we all know about the Navajo Long Walk and the Trail of Tears. We all know about, now I'm forgetting what it's called, the Allotment Act, the Dawes Act. We all know about the Dawes Act. We all know about some very specific pieces of policy that have impacted Native communities, but we're also often learning about the tribal histories of one another's nations so that we can be better educators, so that we can continue to support other teachers outside of our own classrooms and our own schools and our own districts sometimes, to push back and say we need to do better. And we need to think beyond even the borders of our own states to support learning and to provide resources, Sandy, for you in music, that allow students to experience the musical practices of non-Western styles of music. And how do we provide those tools to students and make it engaging while also being respectful of the people that we are learning from? And so I know that there are teachers out there who want to do better and who want to utilize something like our framework, where we're saying like, oh yeah, these terrible things have happened, but these amazing artistic practices and the cultural practices of these different communities have helped to push us forward and helped us to grow and learn even more. And I heard both of you talk about storytelling and art, and how that is also integrated into our teaching practices and how vital that is for Native communities. And for us as educators, is how is that built into our lesson plans beyond just the practices of these culture bearers and artists that we're centering, but that's also a part of how we're teaching, because that, I think, is often a natural part of our teaching experience, is to bring different types of these artistic practices for how it's viewed from outside cultures, but is just often naturally happening within our own communities, is how do we use art to learn and teach, and how do we use true to life experiences of our community members to help other people learn, not just our students, but also our colleagues in education. And Nicole, you shared like what is our educational legacy, and how can we build on that so that we can support learners. And Sandy, you had shared that maybe this doesn't have to happen, but maybe the experiences that we had as students, some of which probably led us to become educators. What if the next generation didn't have that? What if they didn't have to fight against that? What if they didn't have to question their own ways of walking through the world when they walk into a classroom? Because teachers are preparing themselves to respond to those experiences and honor those ways of living, ways of being in the world for their students. And I think it's so amazing to be in conversation with all of the education fellows, because we all want to see a world where that is honored amongst our students. And I'm gonna touch on one more thing that I heard Nicole say, is that we want to give non-Native educators the permission to be co-learners. And I think that is so important and is a part of how we're thinking through this framework and our curriculum, is to say, not only what tools do students need, but what tools do we need to give educators? And so through this framework and through the lessons and the curriculum that we're developing, we're always constantly asking ourselves, what tools do we need to give to teachers? How much training do we need to have ready to provide these educators so that they're ready to teach on this framework? What does honor mean? How do we honor? How can we honor people without creating harm? And those are such big questions that we're constantly engaging with and constantly asking one another in these conversations, because it's so important. And I hear that, I think, every single time I talk to all of you, is to say, like, what questions do we need to ask? And where do we say that, there's no straight answer to this, because we need to honor individual communities, we need to honor individual nations in these many different ways. So I think they're all such big questions and things that I think are very challenging for us to find the answers for. And I've got one more question that I want us to go into before we jump into the questions from our audience. So audience members, please, if you have any questions or comments, please add those either to the chat or the Q&A, so that we can get to those questions after we answer this question. And unless Sandy and Nicole have more to add after this question that they've been thinking about as well. But I want to know, what can this framework or others like it, right? There are other Native people developing resources for classrooms. How can these frameworks and these Indigenous centered ideas shift the narrative around how students learn about the art and lives and cultural practices of Indigenous peoples?
I think this framework will provide quality resources, as we've been talking about, resources that come from the communities, resources that have a multidimensional approach with wide representation across a lot of different Native communities. It'll provide curriculum that's well thought out. It's got a whole person, whole community approach. Context is considered. I think that having those things is going to provide a more accurate narrative, a narrative that's more broad. We've been focusing on in classrooms so much on dispossession only, and that's just a small piece of a Native person's lived experience. So having those quality resources allows students and educators to have more contact with Native communities if they're non-Native, or have more contact with their culture if they are Native, or other cultures that they maybe don't know about. And I think as we broaden the spectrum of what the lived experiences are for people, first for educators and students and in general, that also leads to more connections with understanding that community, more questions. It invites communities to really engage more with one another. So I think this framework is going to help a lot with that. And as I've said before, when students and staff are engaging in content, maybe about Native educator or Native communities, it really benefits everybody. What we do to learn about one community helps us to learn about ourselves. As you start to learn more about other cultures other than your own, you begin to reflect on yourself and look at your own lived experiences. And I think that really helps broaden a person's overall understanding of their place in their communities and their place in the spaces that they reside in. And I think that's a piece that has been missing from education in general, is for students, no matter what their backgrounds are. Sometimes some of the content is just so depersonalized, and this really brings it back to, hey, we have a world. We live in together, we work in together, we play in together, and this is a world that we share. How can we share that in ways that really is considerate of everybody? And it's really hard to argue against that as a benefit. So I think really that sense of shared community, and I think with that also comes a sense of shared responsibility as we learn what issues are impacting maybe one community. Well, as I've been writing the lesson plans for this, I've been talking specifically about, like, for an example, how in Alaska, natural resource development has impacted Native civil rights. that actually can be translated to a lot of different communities where natural resources are being used and extracted and developed. And how do we explore what natural resource development use and extraction looks like if it's done responsibly, if we're thinking about the communities that it's impacting. That's something that goes beyond just the Native community. There's our communities all across the globe right now that are struggling with that very issue. So I think as we develop this curriculum and as students and teachers look at this curriculum, they're going to find something in there that relates back to their own experiences and back to things that they are concerned about. And I think that's a way that this narrative benefits everybody. I've already talked about how it helps to have a broader, I think I used the word spectrum of understanding of Native lives in the community, and just knowing that we're not existing in a vacuum of time from pre-contact and from dispossession. It's just we have these wonderful communities that are doing wonderful things. Since I've worked for 2 non-Native communities now, my understanding, just as a Native person that doesn't necessarily hear a lot about what's going on in my own community, has really jumped leaps and bounds. And as I learn more, it helps me become a more active participant in my community, and it helps me to be a better participant in the society that I live in and that I work with. And oh, hey, these are ways that I can give back to the community, knowing these are what these are things that they're doing or working for. And that's really helpful for Native students to be able to hear that. It's helpful for Native educators to be able to hear that. It's helpful for non-Native communities to be able to hear that too, because there's so much of our experiences that are different, but there's also a lot of things that are shared in our histories and in our the way that we live and work together, and we share our communities. And then I think it also just honestly helps to be able to celebrate and support the achievements of each other as we become better partners and neighbors. It helps to celebrate the Native communities and know what they're doing and that are strengths. I think that part of the conversation can definitely be missing sometimes. We have so much good that's going on, and it's really an honor to be a part of it. And it's really an honor to be a part of this effort here.
Thank you, Sandy. Nicole?
So I think that the framework of the curriculum is built around the 2 major components. I'll just mention those again, which is the learning process and the content. And so for all areas of education, we're thinking those are the main factors that really drive our educational outcomes. So if we're thinking about the learning process and the journey that we're asking educators and students to go on, the framework of know, honor, share, I feel like can really provide multiple entry points into how to authentically engage in this curriculum. And I know, Sandy, you mentioned about, coming from area and where we are out, where we are spread out, all the fellows, and what that lived experience does, right? We have to recognize that as part of our community and part of our lived experience, that we're all going to have multiple perspectives. And I'll just say it, we benefit from multiple perspectives in history. So I've been thinking of this idea with the students and the educators that I'm coaching right now about this idea of a legacy question. What do you want your students to sort of remember about you and the way that you honor them or teach them or the lessons that you've engaged in? So if I think about that legacy question for our students, and educators to challenge previously held narratives and those that perpetuate white supremacy onward to a journey of really a shared history where we're learning traditional lifeways, culture, history, art, stories from first contact until present day. And that takes effort, that takes time, that takes energy, that takes the commitment to being in a space of learning, continual learning, because we can't expect that all educators and students are going to be able to really take action immediately. But I think those small steps are what's going to add up to this being a really a shift in the previously held narrative. So when I teach my Native American units and my lessons to my primary age students, I usually like to start by dispelling stereotypes right off the bat and shifting to presence. And so I'll often ask about 7 and 8 year olds, what do you hear? What comes to your mind? What do you think of when you hear the word Native American or Indian or Indigenous person? And we'll make a list, and it's a lot of teepee and eagle feathers and bow and arrows and some of those things. But I will say within the last 5 years that has shifted, and I don't hear that as often. But it's just a way for me to find entry into the work, and it becomes a question on how to teach presence with relevance and resilience, and start to dispel some of those stereotypes and think about place-based learning and curriculum. I'm out here in Oregon. But I think finding entry points into how we do this work is really important for me to think about, because we have curriculum, we have pacing guides, we have scope and sequence, we have our own lived experience and our own bias, but we really want to make educational spaces more constructive for all students, but especially our Native students, to really counter the Native invisibility that we know all of us have experienced in one situation or another. So in order to make these connections, that really encourage our Native students to be part of the learning community, we do have to recognize the Western curriculum that's being presented, and schools still are very colonized spaces, but we can change that and shift that by amplifying the Indigenous curriculum and lifeways, and really noting the positive impacts that they'll have on our Native students. So I love thinking and dreaming that this curriculum is really going to be historically accurate. It's going to be culturally relevant. It's going to be community-based, contemporary, developmentally appropriate for our students in order to help them become the leaders that we want, for them to be able to show up as their authentic selves. And I really hope that the model, it's a really nice visual where it has the learning process, it has the content, it has our 4 pathways, and then really thinking about how we invite students to share, to honor, and to know traditional lifeways, Native presence. I think it's going to make a better education system for all of us.
Thank you, Nicole. So I want to touch on a few things you both said. Sandy, I heard at the beginning of what you were sharing, you were talking about learning from other cultures and how that can help people to know themselves. And I think that one of the things that I've experienced a lot with people, European descendant Americans, is this perceived idea of a lack of culture, which is where I think we often see this cultural appropriation and then stealing of knowledge from Native communities, where people feel like they don't have something that they come from and that they know. But then often whenever you're engaging in more of these conversations with people to see where our similarities and differences lie, is that we have a lot of different shared experiences as people who come from different ancestry. And the relevance of that for people of any background is to think about those shared experiences that we might have from our ancestors and from our experiences, and also thinking about the differences, but that through learning authentically from different cultures, we can better understand ourselves. And I think that that's so important for students to be able to say that, all of these different ways of living in our world exist, and that they are all beautiful ways of living. They are all amazing and have the same right to exist as anyone else in the world. And that so often for students, we ask them to exist in a little box where they may not see and know all of these different experiences. And so it's so important for us to think about that too, is how can they learn from other people to learn more about themselves. And often we don't figure that out till adulthood, but if we're providing our students with the right tools, we can help them to understand that about themselves at a younger age. And I think that that's so important. And then Nicole, I heard you talking about kind of dispelling those stereotypes, and that this curriculum can help to shift that for students and educators, and that you're hearing that difference amongst students because of those shifts that have been taking place in education over the past 20 years. I think about the questions that I got asked going on field trips in elementary and middle school, and the ridiculous things I would hear from my same aged peers whenever we would go to an event with other schools off the reservation. And it was just like, why would you think that? That is a ridiculous question. And I don't understand why that's your perception of Native people today. And so it's amazing for me not only to hear that from you all, but to have experienced that with my students as well, is that my students never thought that I lived in a teepee. And that is amazing to me, because I knew so many other people when I was their age that thought that that was really what it was like for Native people, present day today. And so it's just amazing to see that growth in how the We the Peoples Before framework and other frameworks that are developed by Native peoples are shifting that perception. And so I think that that's so important. And I want to move from here. I'm going to jump into the questions that we're getting from our participants. I want to go to this question from Irene, is what are some examples of how we navigate through the push from the colonized system that constantly places barriers in the way of our work? For example, state mandates, standards, testing, damaging curriculum requirements, blatant racism, etc. And I think some of this comes into present day conversations around like CRT, and how we're being challenged by outside perceptions outside of education of what's being taught in classrooms and how we're giving students accurate information. So this question is in the chat, not in the Q&A.
Looking at the question in the chat, one of the ways that I have I have kind of dealt with this is when I look at the push for a lot of these things, I feel like there's a lot of policy involved, and then the people who are really engaged in policy making decisions. For myself, I have tried to make sure to continue conversations and welcome the community to continue conversations with the policymakers, being a really active educator where I can. And I know that like schedules get busy, and educators have so much on their plates, but finding ways to have those conversations with admin and with decision makers, and then also showing them what is working in my classroom, and coming to the classroom and letting them know, look, this is the way I'm structuring. These are the ways that I'm structuring my lessons. These are ways that I am doing this from an Indigenous perspective, or a perspective that's more inclusive. And this, these are some of the results, and then questioning those policies that have put barriers up for me, and having those conversations. And I think the conversations, it can be very exhausting sometimes. The conversations feel like they just never stop, but keeping that conversation going, and then inviting my students, my communities, and my parents to be a part of those conversations in positive ways as much as possible. So I've tried to plug myself in those ways throughout my 10 years as an educator, and now as a nonprofit program administrator. A lot of the things that I am doing with that continue to push for schools to examine their policies, as well as to continue to elevate the lived experiences and the stories of the Native communities that I work with to the policymakers, because as much education as we can provide, there's still so much work to do in that area, because it's been kind of set aside for so long.
Thanks, Sandy. Yeah, I was going to touch on some of the things that I do in my practice and in my elementary classroom, which is exactly what you just mentioned. How many times have I made fry bread and invited our superintendent and our board members and people like that who are in educational leadership to come in and see the power of visibility of, if it was my Native unit, or if we're doing Black Lives Matter, things like that. So that's one way to do that, right? Is to really create intentional lessons and bring policymakers and decision makers into your learning spaces so they can see the authentic learning happening. I love that, because again, that's that collective, and that's how we sustain and we confront some of this blatant racism or Native invisibility. So I like to come from a perspective of justice, liberatory design for education, liberation, and ask myself, what does that mean? And then I look at things in my spaces from a healing perspective, because again, as someone who's went through trauma-informed practice, I want to bring my students, my school setting, whatever setting I'm in, whatever space I'm invited into, with a goal of collective healing and what that looks like. And I think of that as racial equity or social justice work. But I think, yes, it's conversations. It's continuing to do your own learning so that that you're visible, right? You're visible as a Native educator. You're visible as an educator who's standing up for social justice. And so those are the kinds of things that I really like to do. And then if I see a practice happening, or like you mentioned, standardized testing or things like that, that we can't get around in some aspects, it's like, well, what else are we doing to support? Where's the bridge? Like, I think of that idea of how we bridge our own work and our heart's work to the work of some of this curriculum that we might not fully support. And really think about liberating ourselves from that. So surrounding yourself with other educators of color is something that I've found a lot of healing in within the last 2 to 3 years. We have a lot of community-based organizations, a lot of affinity group space, and then bringing that back to my district and thinking about and asking questions to those leaders. Maybe it starts with your administrator, and then it starts with your equity director, and then your superintendent, and then you're in board meetings, or invited to share about like how we distribute leadership. So I asked myself, like, how did I get into the room? Can I be myself? What parts can I bring in? And how can I dismantle some of this, what it sounds like systemic oppression? It's not easy, right? We can't do this work on our own. We have to do it collectively. And so I think finding that team of people and really thinking about the steps that you need to sustain and to be able to take action. I think I touched on most of that, but yeah, I think coming together and knowing that our work matters and what you're doing matters. Where we do have to, we're going to come up against barriers, and we're going to have to ask ourselves to do some deep reflecting, and to make sure that we're in a space where we can collectively heal and move on. So yeah, I think, remembering that you deserve professional trust, and that that we can adopt beliefs that will allow us to move forward with this work.
And I think beyond that, as just to add on to everything Sandy and Nicole shared, is to center the needs of our students, because this is a world that they are living in. And when they see things on the news or hear something on the radio about something that's going on in the world, they have questions. And as educators, something that we often do is we want to engage in those questions. We want them to question. We want them to want to learn. And so a big piece of that is to find a way to meet the students kind of between whatever those spaces are. So we have all of these state standards that we have to teach, but there are also these other things that students want to learn about. So where do we find that balance in order to introduce these present day events that they have questions about? So say one of them goes to a powwow where they live, or they're traveling somewhere and they drive through a reservation. They have questions about what these things are. And so one of our roles as educators is to allow space for those questions. And when I've received pushback about some content that I'm teaching in the classroom, I'm always going to bring that back to what my students' needs are and what my students are asking for. So I'm still meeting whatever those requirements that I have to fulfill as an educator. I'm still meeting those requirements. I'm still teaching all of those standards, but I'm supplementing that with some of this additional material, and doing it in a way where I'm not placing blame, but thinking about the values that we want students to have. And so how do we teach from a values-based perspective, which is centering community for us, and for us as Native people, what are those values? And how do we bring that into the classroom so that we're still meeting those obligations that we have within our contract as classroom educators, but also meeting those obligations that we have to our students as people who serve. I serve my students as an educator. So how do I meet their needs? And I'm always prepared to have those conversations with parents and administrators and school boards as well, because I know that I'm coming from a place where my students are centered. And I'm prepared to have those conversations. And I'm also thinking about, like, how is this going to be perceived by someone who doesn't understand or hasn't had an experience to know the true history of Native people wherever I'm living? How do I have these conversations for people who may not be seeing something like Black Lives Matter from the same perspective that I'm viewing it from? So we have to be thinking about that, and how we're centering our students in those conversations. I am going to, sorry, I'm reading all the comments, so I make sure I go to the right question. So the next, we're going to go to Stacy's question next. What have you found as a best practice to introduction of these types of curriculum? And there's more information about her question in the Q&A section, Sandy and Nicole. So Stacy is having kind of some pushback from non-Native colleagues who may not value their perspectives to the same level. And I think that we've all experienced that. And I think that there are different levels to that as well, because we exist within a system that also doesn't always value the viewpoints of women to the same level as we see that value being placed when we're hearing these things from our male counterparts. And so I think that there are different levels to this, but how do you introduce this? Nicole, I know that you do a lot of work in this area in your district and in your state and in the various communities that you exist within. And then Sandy, I know you've worked a lot within DEI spaces. So I think that you both are very prepared to be able to answer this question.
Yeah, I was actually looking at this question earlier and running it through my head because I like to have that little bit of space and time as a Native person to like think about and what I'm going to say and just let it sit for a little while. I think it's really important to remind the people that I'm working with and advocate for the importance of learning from the community, not just another outside voice. Because I don't think that in some instances, I think sometimes the intent with some of that pushback, I don't know if they actually intend to displace my voice or the voices of Native communities. And one thing I always lean back on is what is the intent versus the impact? And I have those conversations a lot with the people that I've worked with over the years. I know that maybe you're intending this, but this is what the impact is. And then creating a safe space to have that conversation with those people so that they're like kind of what we said earlier, they're co-learners. It's not like, aha, I got you. But it's a way to continue to leverage your voice and leverage the voices of the communities that you're serving. So we talk about intent versus impact all of the time, because some things can be really well intended, but the impact is completely different than what was intended. So I think having those conversations can help. I think it also helps to ask reflective questions. Hey, I noticed that I approached you about teaching this curriculum in this way, but then we're actually looking at it this way. What led to those decisions? I think sometimes just having questions that you can ask of the people you're working with can really help. I really love Elena Aguilar's Coaching with Equity book. She talks about being able to flow with resistance in a really great like logical progression. She talks about having conversations with compassion and curiosity and courage and purpose. And she kind of goes over what each one of those look like and how to leverage your voice with that. And a big piece of Elena Aguilar's Coaching with Equity book goes over what are belief systems, how are they formed, and what conditions do we need to provide our co-workers and other people with in order to create safe spaces for them to examine their beliefs or potentially change their beliefs. So I think for me, I've gotten a lot of education on those pieces, and then looked especially for that book is meant really for I think instructional mentors, but I found everything in there to be just really great advice on how to be a better educator and how to leverage my voice in better ways. I've used that as a supervisor. I've used that as a community member. I think it's really good advice for everybody and how to do it in a way that that allows you to continue to create a safe space, even when there's resistance. So flowing with resistance, I think is is a part of what she talks about, and how to create that space for people. Because if you are just putting your voice out there, sometimes I feel like the conversation can stop. And finding ways, especially through curiosity and reflection and reflective conversations, it really allows that conversation to kind of keep flowing. And I think that's really important, is not to get stopped.
Thanks, Sandy. Yeah, beautiful response. I'll just add that, when you are creating that dialogue, when you are in those situations, you're going to come from a place of, like Sandy said, curiosity or wondering, so that you are continuing the movement forward. I know we all feel stifled. We all come up with barriers. And I think maybe that's a question you're asking. What are the barriers to implementing this practice? Or what are the barriers for you to, I'm thinking of our Oregon's Tribal Shared History curriculum. So I often in trainings will ask educators, again, what are those barriers? What are the barriers present, and how can we work together to come up with another pathway that maybe I haven't seen? Or I love the book that Sandy mentioned, Coaching for Equity, and thinking about how do we enter into this work? How do we find multiple entry points into, maybe it's a discussion, maybe it's a meeting, maybe it's a curriculum implementation. Yeah, Sandy, you said it very well. I think coming from a place of respect, curiosity, wondering, and dialogue, and keeping that going forward. We have to have these difficult conversations. We don't want to stop the work. I know that we're all in different situations. We've all been in those where it does feel like a daily fight for social justice or for liberation. And so we do want to keep creating change and inspiring action forward. And so I think coming from that place of curiosity is a really great place to start, and asking those questions.
Thank you both. I think we are just about out of time, so we sadly can't answer any of the remaining questions. But please reach out to me if you have any that you'd like us to follow up on. So I want to thank our panelists, Sandy and Nicole, for sharing your expertise and experiences with our audience today. We also want to thank our audience for sharing your Saturday with us. I'd like to invite you to please join us for our next conversation in May, Reclaiming and Resisting Through Indigenous Art, a conversation with Indigenous artists. And so that will be released on our Instagram, in our newsletter that goes out, on our Facebook, First Peoples Fund's Facebook. It will be advertised in all of those places, and we can also reach out to you from the email list with your sign up to this event. If you would like to learn more about the We the Peoples Before educational initiative or future events, please contact me, Emmy Her Many Horses, and I'm going to put this information in the chat. My email is there in the chat. You can also support this initiative by going to any of the events that I'm sharing here in the chat. firstpeoplesfund.org, which is First Peoples Fund's website, wethepeoplesbefore.org, which shares about our event that will be taking place at the end of June and the beginning of July, as well as sharing more about the educational initiative as that continues to be developed and what's going to be released come in the fall, any additional virtual workshops that we host. And if you would like to support the initiative financially, that link is there as well. We're creating curriculum and resources for educators all across the country, and also will be accessible for families, people who teach from home or in community settings. All of these resources are going to be free and available to the public. So we want to encourage everyone to reach out and utilize the resources. And please reach out to me at Lorna@firstpeoplesfund.org if you have any additional questions. And I just want to say thank you all for joining us today. It was an amazing discussion, Sandy and Nicole, as always. And it looks like some contact information is also shared in the chat So thank you all so much. I appreciate you joining us today.